She thought it was over. She thought she had won. She had the company, the empire, the gate between them, the power to decide when and whether he ever came back in from the cold. She had her sons, her grandfather's letter, her blood-red suit hanging in the closet of a house that was entirely hers. She had rebuilt herself from $43 in a flash drive into the most feared brand architect in Los Angeles, and she had done it while raising 2 children and dismantling a dynasty with her bare hands. She thought she was finished. She was not finished, because Madame Sun had not walked out of that boardroom defeated. She had walked out calculating. And the thing about a woman who has spent 50 years confusing love with control, power with legacy, and loyalty with ownership, the thing Veronica had not yet fully understood about her, is that a woman like that does not accept loss. She redefines it as a temporary setback. And she was already 3 moves into her next game before the elevator doors had closed behind her. What happened next would not be a battle for the company. It would be a battle for the children. And this time, Madame Sun had done something she had never done before in 50 years of calculated warfare. She had hired someone smarter than herself. The image on the screen before you is not the beginning of this story. It is a moment buried deep inside part 2. A moment you will not understand until you have heard everything that came before it and everything that is still coming. That is a Korean man with pale porcelain skin and dark straight hair pulled back, leaning his forehead close to the face of a black woman who is crying. She holds 2 babies against her red-dressed chest. He is close enough to feel her breath. The Korean character tattoo on the side of his neck catches the light, and what is in his face is not the cold appraisal of a man who once called her ugly in a hospital room. What is in his face is the specific anguish of a man who has just discovered something that recontextualizes everything. And what is in her face, even through the tears, even through the pain that is visibly moving through her like weather, is not defeat. It is the face of a woman who already knew, who planned for this moment, who is crying not because she lost, but because winning, this time, cost her something she did not expect to love. Stay with me, because everything you think you know about what happened between these 2 people after the boardroom is about to be rewritten from the foundation. 8 times. And each time it will hit harder than the last. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This story does not slow down for anyone. If you watched part 1 and came back, drop a 1 in the comments so I know my people are here. Share this video right now with someone who needs to watch a black woman win at the highest possible level. Like it, save it, and let us get into part 2 of the story that broke the internet. 6 months after the boardroom, Veronica's life looked like the ending of a fairy tale from the outside. The Santa Monica house, the ocean view. The twins growing into themselves with the particular joyful velocity of children who are loved correctly and consistently. Her company, rebranded publicly now, V Strategic, no longer a ghost but a named visible force in the Los Angeles business landscape, was generating revenue that would have made the Silver Lake mansion look like a down payment. She had a team of 12. She had a waiting list. She had the kind of professional respect that arrives not from charm or self-promotion, but from results that speak in the language that powerful people understand best. She had also, quietly and without announcing it, been watching, because Veronica James had not survived everything she had survived by allowing herself the luxury of believing a war was over, simply because a battle had been won. Her grandfather, had not taught her chess to play one game. He had taught her to see the board in its entirety, not just what was on it, but what hadn't been placed yet, what the other player was holding in their hands, what they were waiting to put down. She knew Madame Sun was holding something. She did not know yet what it was. She would find out on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months and 4 days after the boardroom, when her attorney called at 7:42 in the morning and said 3 words that Veronica heard while standing in her kitchen in a silk robe, watching her sons eat breakfast. "There's a problem." She set down her coffee, put the phone on speaker, kept her face perfectly still for the benefit of the 2 small people at her kitchen table who were watching her the way children watch their mothers for information about whether the world is safe. "Tell me," she said. A forensic legal team, her attorney explained, had filed a challenge to the James Whitfield Trust 3 days ago in Los Angeles Superior Court. The challenge was not disputing the trust's existence or its legitimacy. It was doing something far more surgical than that. It was arguing that the documentation used to establish the trust's relevance to the Sun Group equity structure, the documents Veronica had presented at the IPO board meeting, had been obtained through the possession and use of stolen proprietary property. The flash drive. Veronica was quiet for a moment. The argument, her attorney continued, was that the flash drive had been removed from Sun Group property without authorization, making any evidence derived from it inadmissible in the trust verification process, and potentially exposing Veronica to civil and criminal liability for possession of stolen corporate intelligence. If the challenge succeeded, the trust's claim on the 40% equity stake would be suspended pending re-verification through legally obtained documentation, which did not exist, because the only copy of the original investment agreement was in the Sun Group's own archives, which Madame Sun now controlled. Veronica listened to all of this with both hands flat on the kitchen counter and her eyes on her son's and the particular quality of silence she deployed when something was trying to move her, and she was deciding whether to let it. She did not let it. "Who filed the challenge?" she said. "A forensic legal firm," her attorney said, "newly established, registered in Nevada 4 months ago. Principal attorney listed as a man named Daniel Wu." Veronica's eyes moved to the window. Daniel Wu. She knew that name, not from the Sun family, not from the boardroom. From 7 years ago, when she had been building her first client's brand campaign and had encountered a young forensic attorney working on the opposing side of a corporate acquisition dispute, a man whose mind she had recognized immediately as exceptional, precise, and completely without sentiment. She had noted him the way you note a chess piece of unusual power on the other side of the board. She had also, 7 years ago, quietly and without his knowledge, done something she now understood had been instinct rather than strategy. She had kept his number. She asked her attorney to send her everything filed by Daniel Wu's firm. Then she hung up, looked at her sons eating their breakfast with the complete, trusting peace of children who believe their mother has everything handled, and she said very quietly to herself, "She found someone good." Good, Veronica thought. Then this will be worth winning. Because the first plot twist, the one that Madame Sun believed was her masterstroke, the legal challenge designed to claw back the equity structure through the back door of the flash drive's origins, was built on an assumption. The assumption that Veronica had not anticipated exactly this move, that the flash drive was the only documentation connecting the trust to the Sun Group equity, that Kenji's act of handing it to her outside the hospital had been a spontaneous act of conscience that Veronica had been lucky to receive. None of those things were true, and Madame Sun was about to discover that the woman she was trying to outmaneuver had been 3 steps ahead of this specific move for 8 months. The legal challenge became public within 48 hours of filing, which told Veronica something important. Madame Sun wanted the pressure visible. She wanted investors nervous. She wanted the board Veronica now chaired to question whether the equity structure underpinning the entire governance model was stable. She wanted to create the impression of a foundation with cracks in it, because a board questioning its own foundation is a board that becomes vulnerable to a counter-proposal. Veronica let it sit for 5 days without responding publicly. This was deliberate. On the 5th day, her attorney received a call from a journalist at the Los Angeles Financial Tribune requesting comment on the trust challenge. Veronica had been expecting this call because she had arranged for it. The journalist was someone she had worked with twice before, a woman of absolute professional integrity who verified everything she published and who had, 3 days earlier, received from an anonymous source a very interesting document. The document was a certified copy of the original James Whitfield investment agreement, not the copy from the flash drive, but a separate certified copy filed 18 years ago with the California Secretary of State's office as part of a standard partnership disclosure requirement. A filing that was public record, a filing that had been sitting in a government archive for 18 years, quietly and legally and completely accessible to anyone who knew to look for it. Veronica had found it 4 months before the boardroom. She had not used it at the IPO presentation. She had used the flash drive documentation instead, precisely because she had known that Madame Sun would eventually challenge the flash drive's legitimacy. She had held the Secretary of State filing in reserve, like a card she had no intention of showing, until the moment the other player believed they had taken the game. The journalist published the story at 6 in the morning on a Thursday. By 9, Daniel Wu's legal challenge had lost its primary argument. By 11, there are 3 of the board members who had been quietly making nervous phone calls to each other for 5 days had stopped making nervous phone calls. By 2 in the afternoon, Veronica was in a meeting with her legal team not to discuss the defense of her position, but to discuss the counterfiling she had prepared, a civil action against Madam Sun personally for the attempted subversion of a legally established trust, and the coordinated use of a newly formed legal entity to file a challenge the filer knew to be based on a false premise. Veronica signed the counterfiling with the same steady hand Sun Mi had used to sign the company documents 6 months earlier. Then, she went home and made dinner for her sons. She was not finished, but she allowed herself that evening. The particular satisfaction of a woman who has just watched the opening move of her opponent's second game fall apart before the second move could be made. She was, however, aware that Madame Sun was not finished either. A woman who has spent 50 years building a dynasty does not stop after one failed gambit. She recalibrates, she identifies what went wrong, she finds the variable she had not accounted for, and she removes it. The variable Madame Sun had identified was Kenji. The second plot twist arrived not as a legal document or a journalist's phone call, but as a conversation that happened at 11:47 at night in the parking structure beneath Veronica's Century City office building, 3 weeks after the trust challenge had collapsed. Kenji called her on a line she had not given him. She had a number registered to a shell company connected to V Strategic's operational infrastructure, a number that should not have been traceable to her by anyone outside her core legal team. The fact that he had it told her something. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I need to meet you," he said. "Tonight. There is something you need to know before tomorrow morning." She listened to the quality of his voice, the specific flatness of a man managing something large and doing it imperfectly, and she said, "Parking structure level 2, 30 minutes. She was already there when he arrived. He came alone and he walked to where she stood beside her car, and he did not begin with an apology or a preamble. He said, "She's been watching me since the day I gave you the drive. She knows I gave it to you. Yeah, she has documented every communication I've had with your legal team through a surveillance system she had installed in my personal devices 14 months ago." Veronica looked at him in the flat gray light of the parking structure, and she was very still. "Everything I've passed to your team," he continued, "she has seen. Every strategy discussion, every legal preparation, every document your attorney has sent for my review. The silence between them was the kind that has weight. Madame Sun knew about the Secretary of State filing," Veronica said. "Not as a question." "She knew before you used it," Kenji said. "She let the trust challenge proceed, knowing it would fail because it wasn't about winning the challenge. It was about making you use the filing publicly, so that she could see exactly what you had. She needed to know the full inventory of your evidence before she made a real move." Veronica looked at him for a long moment. "What is the real move?" she said. "She filed in Seoul 3 days ago," Kenji said. "Grand parental rights, South Korean family court. Her argument is that the children are Korean nationals by blood, that their primary custodian, you, has deliberately severed their connection to their Korean cultural heritage, and that their welfare and cultural identity requires legal protection through the Korean court system." The breath Veronica drew in that moment was the only visible evidence of what the information cost her. "International family law," she said quietly. "Different jurisdiction," Kenji said. "Different evidentiary standards. Your California custody arrangements have no automatic standing in Korean family court." She's not trying to take them. She's trying to create a parallel legal process in a jurisdiction where your evidence, your counterfilings, your documented case against her means nothing. Veronica stood in the gray concrete light, and she breathed, and she thought, and she was aware, in the particular way she became aware of large things, that this was the move. This was what Madame Sun had been building toward since she walked out of the boardroom. Not the company, not the equity, not even her own reputation, the children. Because Madame Sun understood something about Veronica that no legal filing could quantify. That everything Veronica had built, every move she had made, every sacrifice she had engineered, it was all for those two boys. The company was for them. The trust was for them. The empire was for them. Take the children's legal security, even temporarily, even theoretically, and you don't just threaten Veronica's family, you threaten the reason she did everything. Veronica looked at Kenji for a long moment. She said, "How long have you known she could see your communications?" Kenji met her eyes. 14 months, he said. She nodded slowly. "So everything you passed to my team," she said, "you knew she was watching?" "Yes." "And you passed it anyway?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment that had multiple layers in it. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me about Seoul." She got in her car, she drove home. And sitting in the driveway of her Santa Monica house at 12:43 in the morning, she allowed herself 60 seconds of the particular fury that comes not from being outmaneuvered, but from understanding the full scale of what someone is willing to do to people they should have protected. Then she picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The third plot twist was the one that broke something open in the architecture of everything, and it came not from Madame Sun's side of the board, but from Sun Mi's. He had been working at the community center in East LA for 5 months. He had not spoken to his mother since the boardroom. He had not attempted to reach Veronica beyond the agreed visitation schedule with the boys, which he honored with the precise, grateful attention of a man who understood that reliability was the only currency he currently had. He arrived when he was supposed to arrive. But he left when he was supposed to leave. He did not ask for more than he had been given, which was itself a form of proof that the man had changed in some fundamental way, because the old Sun Mi had never in his adult life accepted only what he had been given. He called Veronica on a Sunday evening. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "I need to show you something," he said. "Not about the company, not about the boys, about my mother. Something I found that I think you need to have." There was a quality in his voice she had not heard before. Not guilt, which she had heard from him, and not regret, which she had also heard. This was something else. This was the voice of a man who had found something that had rearranged his understanding of his entire life, and was still in the process of deciding what to do with the rearrangement. She told him to leave whatever it was with Kenji. She would collect it. He said, "It's not something I can hand over. You need to hear it directly from me because the context matters, and I am the context." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Tuesday, my office, 45 minutes. He arrived at her Century City office at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and he sat across from her in a room she had chosen specifically because every element of it, the furniture, the light, the chair placement, communicated that she was on her territory and he was a visitor to it. She wore charcoal gray. Her natural hair was in a sleek high bun, her deep mahogany skin clear and composed, her almond-shaped eyes level and giving him nothing. He sat with his jacket on and his hands on the table, and he told her what he had found. 3 weeks earlier, while clearing out an apartment his mother maintained separately from the family residence, a property he had not known existed until a property management company had contacted him as next of kin following a maintenance dispute, he had found a room. Not a room in the architectural sense. A room in the sense of a space that had been entirely dedicated to something. Files, physical files, not digital, physical, because Madame Sun had always understood that digital records could be subpoenaed, hacked, leaked, and traced. Physical files in a locked climate-controlled room in an apartment registered under a name Sun Mi had never heard before. Files on every woman Sun Mi had ever been close to, including the 2 before Veronica, including their current whereabouts, their financial situations, as of the specific mechanisms by which they had been removed from his life and kept removed. Photographs, correspondence. In one case, the Korean-American attorney who had left Los Angeles 7 years ago, a file that included what appeared to be documentation of financial arrangements made to ensure her permanent silence, and at the back of the room, in a separate locked cabinet whose key he had found taped to the underside of a drawer, a file with Veronica's name on it. Not a file about the marriage, a file that predated the marriage by 3 years. Sunmi set a photograph on the desk between them. Veronica looked at it. It was a photograph of her grandfather, James Whitfield, taken outside a building she recognized, a building in downtown Seoul, dated 11 years ago, with Madame Sun standing beside him. Veronica's face remained completely still. "They knew each other," Sunmi said. "Before you and I ever met, before the Series A investment, my mother knew your grandfather. She knew about the investment. She knew it was structured as a trust. She knew when she first introduced me to you at the event where we met." She paused and looked at him, and he held her gaze and said it plainly. "She engineered that introduction. She introduced us." The air in the room changed. "She knew who you were," he said. "She knew about the trust. She introduced us because she believed that if I married you, and then the marriage was dissolved on her terms, the trust's claim would be nullified through marital forfeiture. She had a legal opinion prepared 3 years before we were married, arguing that if you were removed from the marital relationship under conditions of fraud, your fraud, not hers, the trust equity would revert." He set another document on the desk, the legal opinion, dated 8 years ago, stamped with the name of a Seoul law firm. "She brought us together to tear us apart," he said, "because tearing us apart was the mechanism through which she intended to absorb the trust equity back into the Sun Group and eliminate the one external claim on the company's founding stake that she had never been able to control." Veronica looked at the photograph of her grandfather and Madame Sun standing outside a building in Seoul 11 years ago. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about her grandfather sitting across from her at a chessboard when she was 6 years old, telling her the board always tells the truth. She thought about his letter. The board was yours before he ever sat down. He had known, not the details, not the specifics, but he had known that the woman who had stood beside him outside that building in Seoul and smiled was not to be trusted, and he had structured the trust not just as an investment vehicle, but as a shield he had built because he had looked at Madame Sun across a table and understood, with the instinct of a man who had survived 60 years of navigating people who confused power with ownership, exactly what she was. He had built Veronica's winning hand before the game had started. Veronica pressed her fingers to her lips. She sat with that for a moment. Then she looked at Sunmi and she said, "Do you have the original key to the cabinet?" He set it on the desk. She picked it up. She said, "Go back to the community center. I will contact you when I need you." He stood. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who wants to say something and understands this is not the time for it. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He stopped. He said, "I'm sorry. Not for the company. Not for what it cost me. For what it cost you. For what I allowed to be done to you in a hospital room while you were holding our sons. For every day between that room and this one. I know those words don't repair anything. I just need you to have them." Veronica did not turn around. She said, "I have them." He left. She sat in her Century City office with a key in her hand and a photograph of her grandfather and her enemy standing together in Seoul 11 years ago. And she understood with the full, clear, devastating precision of a woman who had been playing a game she hadn't known the real rules of, that the story she had thought she was telling about herself was missing its first chapter. And the first chapter changed everything about what the last chapter needed to be. Right now, before we go any further into what Veronica does with that key and that photograph, drop your city in the comments. Where in the world are you watching this from? I want to see every city, every country, every time zone. And tell me this, did you see that twist coming? Because Madame Sun engineered the entire relationship from the beginning. Does that change how you feel about Sunmi? Is he a victim of his mother, or is he still responsible? The comment section is yours. Let's talk about it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, because what happens next, what Veronica does with what she just learned, is going to make part 1 look like the warm-up. The fourth plot twist came from a direction Veronica had not fully secured, which was itself a lesson she filed away for later, that the most dangerous vulnerabilities are always the ones you believe you have addressed. She had built her board carefully, 12 members selected for competence, integrity, and the specific quality of independence she required. She had run background checks. She had verified loyalties. She had been, she believed, thorough. she had not been thorough enough. And 3 weeks after Sun Mi's visit to her office, at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday, a story appeared in a national financial publication under the byline of a journalist Veronica had never dealt with. The story was detailed, sourced, and specific. It alleged that V Strategic's rise had not been built purely on brilliance and legitimate consulting, but had been supplemented by a pattern of industrial intelligence gathering. Specifically, that V had built client strategies using proprietary competitive data obtained through methods that existed in a legal gray area at best and constituted corporate espionage at worst. The story did not name sources, but it included details that could only have come from inside Veronica's organization, specific internal strategy documents, meeting notes, a consultant's report that had been prepared for a single client and shared with no one outside the client relationship. The kind of details that required not a leak, but a pipeline, someone inside the operation with access to core documentation and a reason to share it. Veronica read the story at her desk at 11:14, and she was on her internal communication system at 11:15, asking her head of operations for the complete access log for the documents referenced in the article. She had the answer by noon. 4 of the documents had been accessed in the previous 6 weeks by a single user with elevated system permissions, a board member who had been appointed 8 months ago following a recommendation from a tech investor whose name Veronica now cross-referenced against the Sun Group's historical investor network. The connection was 2 layers deep and required a particular quality of attention to find, but it was there. Madame Sun had not planted someone in Veronica's organization after the boardroom. She had planted someone before it, before the IPO, before the trust challenge, before any of the Second War had begun. She had placed a board member in Veronica's company during the period when V Strategic was growing rapidly and taking on new governance infrastructure, when Veronica was building fast and could not yet afford to be as deliberate as she would later become. It was, Veronica had to acknowledge, excellent timing. She sat with the access log and the connection map and the journalist's story, and she thought about the room in Madame Sun's private apartment and the files and the locked cabinet and the photograph, and she thought, how long have you been doing this? How far back does this go? Is there a single element of my life in the last 4 years that you did not place your hands on? The thought was briefly vertiginous. Then it was fuel. She called her attorney at 12:30, and she asked for a comprehensive forensic audit of every board appointment made in the last 18 months, with particular attention to the chain of recommendation for each appointment. She asked for it quietly, through channels that did not involve the board member in question, and she asked for it completed within 72 hours. She then called the journalist who had published the story, not to deny it, not to threaten it, to ask one question: was the source someone who identified themselves as being connected to the Sun family or Sun Group? The journalist, bound by source protection, said nothing, which told Veronica everything. She then did something that the planted board member, the journalist, and Madame Sun did not anticipate. She published her own story first, not a rebuttal, not a denial. A comprehensive, fully documented account of the corporate espionage campaign conducted against V Strategic by a coordinated effort connected to the Sun Group's former leadership, including the placement of an operative on her board, the surveillance of her key allies' communications, the Seoul family court filing, the trust challenge, and the original legal opinion prepared 8 years before her marriage with the intention of nullifying the James Whitfield Trust. She released it through 3 major financial publications simultaneously at 6 in the morning on a Friday. By 9, the planted board member had tendered a resignation. By 11, the journalist who had published the original story had issued a correction noting that the source documents had been provided under false pretenses by an individual with an undisclosed conflict of interest. By 2 in the afternoon, Madame Sun's legal team had filed a response calling Veronica's account defamatory. By 4, Veronica's legal team had filed the evidence package in response. The evidence package included the photograph from Seoul. The 5th plot twist arrived not as an attack, but as a collapse, and it came from a place Veronica had not been watching because she had not believed it required watching. Sun Mi had been doing what he said he would do. The community center, The simple clothes, the careful, reliable presence at the gate, and the patient waiting for more than what he had been given. He had been, by every observable measure, the man he had claimed he was becoming. What he had not told Veronica, what he had not told anyone, was that 3 weeks after his visit to her Century City office, his mother had called him. Not to strategize, not to coordinate. She had called him from the private apartment whose existence he had not known about until 3 weeks prior, and she had told him, in the particular voice of a woman who has run out of maneuvers and has arrived at the last weapon in the room, that she was sick. Not performing sick, not strategically sick in the way powerful people sometimes deployed illness as a manipulation. She was actually sick, had been sick for 7 months, had been managing a diagnosis she had kept from everyone, including her medical team's coordination contacts, because she had not wanted it to become a variable in the legal and corporate battles she was fighting. Sunmi had sat with that information alone for 3 weeks. He had not told Veronica because he did not know how to tell her without it sounding like a plea for mercy on his mother's behalf, and he did not believe he had the standing to make that plea, and he was not entirely sure he wanted to make it. He had not told Veronica because he was afraid of what she would do with the information. He had not told Veronica because he was afraid of what it would do to him to watch her make a decision that he understood she had every right to make. Veronica found out not from him but from Kenji, who had found out from the private medical coordinator Madame Soon used, and who had contacted Veronica because he believed she deserved to know. She sat with it for 2 days. Then she did something that surprised everyone who thought they understood her, including the audience watching this story, including possibly herself. She went to see Madame Sun, not to negotiate, not to threaten, not to present an evidence package or extract a concession. She went alone, in simple clothes, on a Thursday afternoon, to the private apartment she now knew the address of, and she knocked on the door. Madame Sun opened it. They looked at each other across the threshold of an apartment that contained a room full of files about people this woman had systematically destroyed, and for the first time in the entire course of their war, neither of them was in a designed environment. There was no boardroom, no mesh screen, no lawyer present, no audience, no armor beyond what each of them had built permanently into their own skin. Madame Sun looked older than she had in the boardroom, not broken, not diminished, but the precise, maintained quality of her appearance had been allowed to relax slightly in the privacy of her own space, and what was underneath it was simply a woman who was 70 years old and had spent those 70 years in a war she had started for reasons that, stripped of all the architecture of power and legacy and tradition, which were considerably smaller than the destruction they had caused. Veronica said, "I'm not here about any of it. The court filings, the board member, the journalist, none of it. I came because you are the grandmother of my sons, and I needed to see for myself what that means now." Madame Sun looked at her for a long moment. She did not invite her in, but she did not close the door either. Veronica said, "I'm going to continue to protect my children and my company and my position from every legal and strategic threat, regardless of what else is true. That will not change. But I want you to understand something that is also true at the same time. Your grandsons exist because of choices made by both of us. They carry both of us in them. And the question of what kind of grandmother you will be allowed to be to them is not a question I have answered yet, because I am waiting to see what kind of person you are willing to become now that the war is over." Madame Sun's eyes held hers. "You believe the war is over," she said. "I know it is," Veronica said, "because everything you had left to use, you have used, and I'm still standing. And your son is still choosing his children over the empire every day. So yes, I believe the war is over." She left. She drove home. She did not know whether Madame Soon would receive what she had said as an olive branch or as a final statement of dominance. She suspected it might be both simultaneously, and she had made her peace with that ambiguity because she had stopped needing resolution from other people a long time ago. She needed it only from herself. The sixth plot twist was the one that remade the architecture of Veronica's understanding of her own story, and it arrived in the form of a phone call from Daniel Wu, the forensic attorney Madame Sun had hired to file the trust challenge. He called Veronica directly, on the same shell company line Kenji had used at 8 in the morning on a Monday, and he said, "I think we should meet." She said, I think so too. They met in a coffee shop in Silver Lake, deliberately chosen because Veronica had always believed in returning to the sights of things as a form of claiming them. And Daniel Wu sat across from her with his precise economical presence and his exceptional mind, and he said, "I want to tell you something about how I came to be hired by the Sun family." She said, "Tell me." But he said, "I was approached 18 months ago by an intermediary representing a client who needed a forensic legal team for a complex trust challenge. The brief was detailed, comprehensive, and legally sophisticated. The intermediary provided all of the relevant documentation up front, including the trust documents, the flash drive provenance argument, and the California Secretary of State filing." Veronica's coffee cup was halfway to her mouth. She set it down. "The intermediary told me," Daniel Wu continued, "that the client needed someone who could file the challenge and make it visible enough to serve as a pressure instrument, but that the challenge itself was designed to fail, that its purpose was not to win, but to cause Madame Sun to believe it was her idea and to adopt it as her primary legal strategy, thereby keeping her occupied in a California court process while Veronica's team prepared the international response to the Seoul filing she had not yet made but was expected to make." Veronica was very still. "The intermediary," Daniel Wu said, "gave me a name to use as my cover identity and a firm to register in Nevada and a very specific brief that included, almost word for word, the argument I filed." He paused. "The intermediary was a woman. She never identified herself by name, but she gave me a contact number for emergencies, the same number I called this morning." He slid a card across the table. On it, in handwriting Veronica recognized because it was her own, was a phone number. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at Daniel Wu. "You were working for me," she said. "From the beginning," he said. "I didn't know your full identity until the boardroom coverage identified V, but I understood from the brief I was given that I was part of something much larger than the case on paper." He paused. "I thought you should know, now that it's over, that the strategy worked exactly as designed." Veronica sat in a Silver Lake coffee shop on a morning that was warm and ordinary and impossible, and she understood, with the full, staggering clarity of a woman encountering the complete picture of her own intelligence, that she had planted Daniel Wu in Madame Sun's path before the first war had ended, that she had prepared the instrument of the second war's containment while she was still fighting the first one, that the trust challenge had not been Madame Sun's masterstroke, but Veronica's. She had given Madame Sun her best weapon. She had made it for her. She had handed it to her through an intermediary and watched her pick it up and deploy it and exhaust her legal credibility and her remaining board relationships and her financial reserves on a challenge built to collapse, while Veronica's team, undistracted, had been preparing the international response, the evidence package, the forensic board audit, and the comprehensive publication that had dismantled the Second War before Madame Sun had understood the first battle was a fiction. The board was yours before he ever sat down. Veronica looked at the card with her own handwriting on it. She thought about her grandfather. She thought, "I learned from the best." The seventh plot twist arrived on a Sunday afternoon at the Santa Monica house. And it arrived not as a threat or a strategy, but as a moment. And sometimes, moments are the things that break open what strategy cannot reach. Sun Mi was in the garden with the boys. He came every Sunday now, and the visits had evolved from the careful provisional exchanges of people managing a damage to something that had more ease in it, more breath. The boys had begun to expect him, had begun to run to the gate when they heard the click of the latch, had begun to say a word that Veronica had not prepared herself for emotionally and had not allowed herself to examine too carefully. She was inside when she heard one of them fall, the particular cry of a toddler who has hurt themselves, sharp, immediate, requiring the specific response of the person they trust most in the world. She was out the door in 3 seconds, and when she came through the garden doorway, she found Sun Mi already on his knees on the grass, the older boy in his arms, checking the scraped knee with the focused, efficient attention of a man who had been practicing being a father with the same seriousness he had once applied to corporate strategy. The boy stopped crying. He pressed his face against Sun Mi's shoulder. Veronica stood in the garden doorway, and she watched this, and she felt something move through her that she had not given herself permission to feel since the hospital room 10 months before the boardroom. Something that lived below strategy and below intelligence, and below the magnificent architecture of everything she had built, something that was simply human. Sunmi looked up and saw her standing there. He did not say anything, neither did she. But something passed between them in that garden in the afternoon light, something that was not forgiveness, which was too large and too complicated for an afternoon in a garden, and not love, which was a word that required more safety than they had yet established between them, but something that was the beginning of the conversation that precedes both of those things. The conversation that starts with, "I see you trying," and "I see it costing you something," and "I have not decided what that means yet, but I am not unwilling to find out." She went back inside. She stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands on the counter. Then she allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, not from pain. She from the particular overwhelming complexity of a woman who has won everything she set out to win and is standing on the other side of the winning and discovering that the other side is not an ending. It is a different kind of beginning, one that requires a different kind of courage than the kind she had already proven she possessed, the courage of allowing, of not controlling every variable, of opening a gate she had kept closed for a reason and trusting herself to know if and when it needed to close again. She dried her face. She went back outside. She sat in the garden chair and she watched her sons play with their father in the late afternoon light, and she held her wine, and she was present in a way she had not allowed herself to be present since the hospital room, fully in the moment, not calculating the next move, not monitoring the horizon for threats, just there, just alive, just Veronica. The 8th plot twist was the last one, and it was the one nobody saw coming. Not Madame Sun, not the board, not Kenji, not Daniel Wu, and not Sun Mi. It came from Veronica herself. 2 months after the Sunday afternoon in the garden, after the legal dust of the Second Ward settled into the permanent record of public documentation, after the Seoul filing had been withdrawn by Madame Sun's legal team following the evidence package publication, after the planted board member had been replaced and the forensic audit had been completed and every thread of the second campaign had been cut clean, Veronica called a board meeting. The board assembled in the Century City boardroom at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. Tree and Veronica sat at the head of the table in the chair she had earned in a white suit, deliberately chosen because white meant something different on her than it had on Madame Sun, and she wanted that difference visible. And she told her board that she had a structural proposal to present. The proposal was this. She was transferring 15% of the Sun Group equity held by the Whitfield Trust into a new vehicle, a foundation named for her grandfather, with a mandate to fund the education of first-generation college students from underrepresented communities in Los Angeles. She was also proposing, for board approval, the reappointment of Sun Mi to a non-executive advisory role within the company, not as a concession, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as a business decision. Yeah, because he understood the technical architecture of the company's founding systems better than anyone alive, and that knowledge had value and using it was intelligent. The board approved both proposals. Then Veronica set a final document on the table. She had prepared it herself, without her legal team, over 3 weeks of evenings after her sons were in bed. It was not a legal document in the conventional sense. It was a public letter, intended for publication, addressed to the women who had come before her, the architect, the attorney, the unnamed others she suspected existed in files she had not found. The women Madame Sun had removed from Sun Mi's life before Veronica had ever arrived in it. The letter said that she had seen their files, that she understood what had been done to them, that she was establishing a legal fund. It administered through the James Whitfield Foundation to support any woman who believed she had been subject to a coordinated removal campaign connected to the Sun family and wished to pursue her legal options. It was not vengeance, it was accountability deployed at scale. It was Veronica James understanding that the most powerful thing she could do with what she had survived was not to protect herself alone, but to make it impossible for anyone to survive what she had survived in silence. She published the letter. It was read by 400,000 people in the first 24 hours. By the end of the week, 2 women had contacted the foundation. The week after that, 5 more. Veronica read every letter personally. She responded to each one. She did it early in the mornings before her sons woke up. Sitting at her kitchen table in her silk robe with her coffee, her deep mahogany skin catching the dawn light through the factory windows she had replaced with proper glass in the Santa Monica house, her natural hair loose around her shoulders, reading the words of women who had believed they were alone in something and were discovering that they were not. She was aware, reading those letters, that she was also reading her own story from angles she had not previously had access to, seeing it from outside herself, seeing the pattern of it, understanding that her grandfather had structured a trust and a legacy, not just for her sons, but for every person connected to the chain of events his investment had set in motion. He had known the board was larger than one game. She had understood that in theory. She was understanding it now in practice. On the last Friday of December, the Santa Monica house was full of a particular kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The twins were almost 2, had recently discovered opinions about everything, and were exercising those opinions at considerable volume, and the house that had once been a symbol of everything Veronica had built alone was now something slightly different, still hers, fundamentally and permanently hers, but inhabited differently, more noisily, more fully. Sunmi was there for a dinner that was not a date and not a family reunion and not a negotiation. It was simply a dinner, the specific ordinary thing that very extraordinary circumstances had made them work toward for the better part of a year. He had cooked. This was something Veronica had not known he could do, and the discovery of it had shifted something small but real in her understanding of who he was, separate from who his mother had built. They sat at her kitchen table after the boys were in bed, and the city was quiet beyond the windows. And Veronica looked at him across the table with the clear, direct, unflinching gaze she had always given to things she was deciding. She said, "I need you to understand something." He looked at her and waited. She said, "What I am willing to explore with you is not because of what you signed or what you gave up or what you chose at the boardroom. Those were the floor, the minimum, the baseline of what decency required." She paused. "What I am willing to explore with you is because of what you have done in the months after all of that. It was when there was no audience and no performance, and no one was watching. The community center. The Sundays at the gate. The way you sat with our son in the garden when he fell. The way you told me about your mother's room without trying to leverage it into forgiveness." She looked at him steadily. "I am not forgiving you," she said. "Forgiveness is a longer road than this table and this dinner. But I am telling you that I see what you are doing, and I am willing to be in the same room with the person you are becoming. On my terms, at my pace." She paused. "And if you make one move that suggests you have forgotten what it cost me to sit here and say that, I will remind you in ways that will be thorough and permanent." Sunmi looked at her across the table. And what was in his face was not relief or gratitude or the performed humility of a man who has found a way back to something he wanted. What was in his face was something that required more than any of those words, a kind of recognition. The specific, full recognition of a man seeing a woman completely, and understanding that what she had just offered him was not a concession, but a gift of extraordinary proportions, given by someone who had every reason in the world not to give it, and that the only appropriate response to a gift of that magnitude was to hold it with the same quality of care and precision and steadiness with which it had been given. He said, "I understand." She nodded. She poured him more wine. Outside, the Pacific carried its cold, dark breath against the Santa Monica shore, and the city performed its endless, ordinary theater of lives being lived, and inside a kitchen in a house that was entirely and permanently hers, Veronica James sat across from the man who had once tried to break her and had instead, in the trying, made her into something far beyond what either of them had been capable of imagining when they were standing in a Silver Lake house, believing in something simpler. She had the company. She had the foundation. She had the trust and the letter and the key to a locked room that had told her the truth about everything. She had her sons, who were asleep in the next room, growing into people who would one day ask her who she was before they were born, and she would tell them everything, every word of it, not as a wound, as a map. She had herself, all of herself, the full, extraordinary, hard-won, magnificent sum of a woman who had been told she was ugly in a room full of lilies and had taken that single word and built an empire from it that the man who said it now sat across from, grateful to be in the same room. She had everything. And she had decided, not in the grand public gesture of a boardroom or the precision of a legal filing, but in the quiet of an ordinary dinner on an ordinary Friday, that everything was enough. Not a ceiling, a foundation. Her grandfather had taught her chess. She had learned something he hadn't taught her. Sometimes the most powerful move on the board is not the one that takes the king. It is the one that decides what the board is for. She had decided. And now, in the particular piece of that decision, Veronica James picked up her wineglass, looked out the window at the city that had watched her fall, and had watched her rise, and had never once been able to contain her, and she allowed herself something she had not allowed since before the hospital room, since before the lilies, since before she had learned what it cost to love someone who had not yet learned how to receive it. She allowed herself to simply be happy, not performing it, not managing it, not calculating its strategic implications, just happy, just Veronica, just herself, which had always, from the very beginning, been enough, more than enough, everything. And the napkin was still in the fireproof case under the sink, beside her grandfather's letter and the flash drive and the key to a locked room in a Bel Air apartment. She would keep it there. Not as a wound, and not as evidence, and not as a reminder of what she had survived, as proof of what she had built from it, as the first page of the longest game she had ever played, and the last one she would ever need to win. Right now, I need to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city in the comments. Every single one of you. And tell me this, tell me honestly, did you see the Daniel Wu twist coming? Did you know Veronica had planted him before the Second War started? Because that is the move that separates a great player from a legendary one. She didn't just win the second game, she built the board for it while she was still fighting the first one, and Madam Sun, does she deserve to know her grandchildren after everything, after every move she made? Is illness a reason for mercy or just another variable on the board? Give me your verdict in the comments. Subscribe right now if you are not already here, because part 3 of this universe is already being built, and you do not want to come in late to what is coming. Share this video with every person in your life who needs to watch a black woman outsmart an entire empire and win on her own terms. Like this video if Veronica is the kind of woman you want to be in the room with. She won every single time. And she did it without losing herself in the process. That is the whole story. That is all of it. And it started with a napkin.